October 3, 2025, 02:47 a.m., Sevastopol Bay, Crimea. The surface of the water is a sheet of black glass, disturbed only by the low wake of tugboats nudging two heavy silhouettes toward their berths. For several consecutive nights, reconnaissance drones from Ukraine's defense intelligence have logged the same ritual: the return of two Ivan Gren-class landing ships, assets whose combined price tags and troop lift capacity give them outsized value in the Black Sea campaign. The city above sleeps under curfew. The bay below becomes a metronome of navigation lights and engine noise. From the third-person vantage of planners tracing signals and heat blooms, the scene is not ordinary traffic. It is a window. Sevastopol's defenses wear the reputation of impregnability. Layered S-400 batteries pushed inland. Panzer units in Odesa. Officers from the Air Force and Naval Intelligence give the interval a name: Operation Tidefall. The concept is austere. Commit weight, timing, and precision when both targets are fixed inside the kill box. No attritional harassment at sea. No telegraphed probing. A single concentrated act in the one place the adversary believes to be immune. The choice of weapons speaks to constraints and ingenuity in equal measure. FAB-3000s, relics of a different era, refitted with glide kits and modern guidance to trade drag for range and guesswork for geometry. On a planning table, their ballistic curves intersect with the mooring coordinates of the two ships like chalk lines crossing at an X above Crimea. Unarmed drones orbit high and quiet, their cameras reducing the harbor to gridded pixels of temperature and motion. Each tug's path becomes a thread. Each reflector and pier light an anchor point to be matched later against a pilot's heads-up symbology. The bay's black water turns into data, angles, speeds, distances, until the human eye is no longer needed to see the pattern. Inside the command room, voices stay level. There is no rhetoric, only confirmations. Fuel states, wind layers, jamming fields, the integrity of a corridor through which strike aircraft at 0250. The signal watchers catch the expected dip in coverage. The landing ships continue their slow arc toward the inner wall, boxed in by concrete and routine. Tug crews blink floodlights across the surface, unknowingly sketching reference points for weapons that have not yet arrived. The harbor's alarms are quiet. The city's sirens rest. Yet the scene has already shifted in the ledger of the night. From transit to target fixation. The clock that matters now is the one counting down from the first release altitude to the first detonation, measured not in hours but in seconds that have been by 0255. The waiting is over. Coordinates are frozen. The window is open. The bay, unchanged to any civilian eye, October 3, 2025, 03:30 a.m., Odesa, Coastal Operations Center. The room hummed with screens and the quiet fatigue of people who had watched the same datasets for weeks. In the third-person view of the planners, the strike was not a single act but the sum of many small, deliberate choices. Which sensors to trust, which old munitions to revive, which electronic seams to exploit. What transpired in those hours before the bombs left the rails was engineering applied to uncertainty. Engineers had turned to what was available. FAB-3000 bombs sat in storerooms as relics of a previous era. Their mass promised destructive effect, but not the precision required for an enclosed harbor. In a converted hangar, technicians fitted glide kits, improvised aerodynamic surfaces, hardened fins, and compact INS/GNSS guidance modules scavenged from retired kits. Fuses were reworked for delayed internal detonation rather than surface blast. Stabilizers were reinforced to survive high-altitude release and long glides. Each modification was tested in simulation and on discrete drop ranges. Each marginal gain in circular error probability translated into lives saved or lost when the weapons entered a crowded harbor. Intelligence layered itself like an onion. Satellite imagery delivered theater-scale confirmation. The docks, the fuel depots, footprints of supply convoys. Medium-altitude drones filled gaps in time-sensitive data, producing thermal profiles of the ships and mapping which compartments were most likely to contain vehicles or fuel. Signals units triangulated tug chatter and port communications to verify crew rotations and refueling schedules. Human reports, drivers, fishermen, port workers, were folded into databases and cross-checked for the small discrepancies that betray routine. The analysts were not chasing certainty. They chased probability until it crossed an acceptable operational threshold. Electronic warfare and deception danced together. Decoy transponders and low-value drone flights had already been used to compel defenders to allocate attention and expended intercept cycles. On the night in question, timing offsets in emissions were deliberately introduced to create a predictable seam. A corridor through which aircraft could transit, while jamming nodes reoriented. That seam existed for minutes and required precise synchrony from air crews, jammers, and reconnaissance assets. Simulators replayed the ingress path hundreds of times until pilots internalized the profile. altitudes, speeds, bank angles, and the moment of release compressed into a mechanical reflex. Legal and policy layers were present though remote from the blast. Commanders briefed rules of engagement and collateral risk models to senior staff who signed authorizations. The mission passed through multiple checks: operational, legal, political, each one adding friction, but reducing the possibility of catastrophic error. Meteorological teams provided micro-forecasts: wind shear at release altitude, surface humidity that would affect thermal signatures, and temperature inversion layers that could bend radar returns. Fuel margins were calculated to allow for circuitous egress if countermeasures elongated flight time. Logistics were surgical. The aircraft were pre-staged at dispersed airfields with careful attention to signatures. Ordnance was handled under strict chain-of-custody protocols. Alternate corridors existed in case a single node failed. Recovery plans and casualty evacuation procedures were in place before anyone stepped into a cockpit. Communications ran on redundant, encrypted channels, so that a single jamming burst could not collapse the entire control architecture. On the tactical table, the planners modeled the harbor as a physics problem. Impact points were selected not only for maximum hull penetration, but for the secondary effects likely to induce sympathetic detonations: fuel vapors, vehicle ammunition, and compressed stores. They balanced the destructive intent against the imperative to limit collateral harm to civilian infrastructure, like water intakes and hospitals. Those margins shaped release windows and attack vectors. The mission's aim was to deny capability, not to create indiscriminate devastation. As the minutes contracted toward release, the human element tightened into disciplined quiet. Pilots ran through final checks. Weapons officers verified guidance alignment. Drone operators watched heat maps flicker. A last validation loop confirmed that the corridor held. No unexpected naval traffic, no surges in radar emissions, no civilian vessels entering the kill box. The final authorization, though short, carried the weight of weeks of analysis. A calculated act of risk calibrated to a sliver of opportunity. When the order came, the preparation that had seemed slow and granular resolved into motion. The systems designed to reduce uncertainty did their job. The human operators executed with the precision that those systems required. In the thin pause before weapons release, every trajectory, every timing decision, and every engineering compromise converged toward a single point where physics would determine the rest. October 3, 2025, 03:06 a.m., Sevastopol Bay. The release was a single, clean moment born of layered preparation. From the planner's vantage, it unfolded with the cold efficiency of applied mechanics. Aircraft at release altitude, guidance locked, the corridor still unobstructed. Two FAB-3000s slipped free into the night, their improvised wings catching thin air as inertial and satellite guidance set them on paths calculated to intersect with the ship's most vulnerable spaces. The first weapon struck the Minsk forward, not as a surface impact, but as a penetrating event designed to detonate within enclosed volume. A forward vehicle deck that, when rupture occurred, amplified blast pressure inward and upward. The ship's hull did not merely fail. Compartments collapsed outward as internal overpressure carved cavities through the plating. The second bomb found the Novocherkassk amidships, its delayed fuse assuring an internal detonation sequence that maximized sympathetic ignition of fuel lines and stored materiel. In both cases, the aim was structural defeat rather than superficial damage. The immediate physics translated into catastrophic kinetics. The initial explosions produced rapid gas bubbles beneath the surface because of the high explosive yield interacting with seawater. Those bubbles collapsed in microseconds, sending jets of water and metal upward with destructive force. The resulting shockwave propagated through water and air with different profiles, an underwater overpressure lethal to unprotected hulls, and a surface blast that shattered windows and set off unsecured flammable materials on the quayside. Observers later described a column of fire and spray rising tens of meters, debris spinning like a macabre rain. Thermal effects followed. Aviation fuel and diesel ignited into sustained blazes, while polymeric insulation, lubricants, and hydraulic fluids produced thick black smoke and toxic plumes. On deck, ammunition that had been safe under routine conditions began to cook off. Each sympathetic explosion generated additional fragmentation and secondary fires. Each secondary fire created new points of vulnerability and reactive detonations. Firefighting assets, tugs, and harbor units attempted to approach but were repelled by blast fragments and shifting currents of burning hydrocarbon. The harbor itself became a dynamic hazard zone. Waves carried burning slicks, and eddies held incandescent residues that ignited on contact with boats. Human responses were immediate and disordered. Many sailors were in low readiness states while moored. The blast wave incapacitated watch teams and damaged communication nodes. Survivors recounted minutes of confusion compounded by extreme heat and opaque smoke. Rescue attempts were hampered by the continued detonations and by the physical instability of the piers and mooring points. Medical teams set improvised triage stations on quays, treating blast trauma, severe burns, and inhalation injuries. Evacuations were sporadic, prioritized by proximity and survivability, while attempts to recover classified material from the surviving sections of hulls were deferred in the face of ongoing conflagration. From an imaging and forensics perspective, the strike produced signatures that investigators would parse for weeks. Infrared satellite passes captured the thermal evolution of each hull, peak temperatures, burn duration, and spatial dissipation, while acoustic records documented low-frequency pulses consistent with large explosive yields. Radar returns before and after the event showed a rapid disappearance of 2 substantial radar cross-sections, replaced by multiple transient scatterers, debris, small craft, and burning slicks. Investigators later used these data sets to reconstruct timing sequences and to estimate munition performance against hardened decks. Operationally, the strike achieved immediate objectives and introduced new complications. Both ships were rendered inoperable. Their capacity to project amphibious force evaporated along with their structural integrity. Dockside infrastructure, cranes, fueling stations, and maintenance sheds suffered heavy damage, reducing the port's ability to support rapid repairs or to generate sortie rates. Navigation lanes in the inner harbor became clogged with wreckage and incendiary slicks, complicating any immediate salvage or threat reduction operations. The attacker's exit was as critical as the approach. Electronic warfare teams masked the corridor just long enough for the bombers to egress. By the time local air defenses reoriented, the strike aircraft were beyond engagement range. Command and control nodes in Odesa recorded a brief blackout in Russian defensive telemetry, a gap that had been the operation's hinge. For planners, that blackout validated the synchronization between reconnaissance, EW, and strike elements. For defenders, it became the central failure to be corrected. Within hours, the public and private media ecosystems ingested the visual spectacle. Curated clips of the explosions circulated alongside leaked port footage and satellite stills. Each image carried strategic value. For the attackers, proof of discrimination and effect. For the defenders, material for claims of rescue and victimhood. The information battle that followed mirrored the kinetic one. Competing narratives shaped diplomatic reactions, influenced domestic morale, and framed subsequent operational decisions. Environmental consequences began to accrue almost immediately. Hydrocarbon contamination spread beneath the smoke. Municipal intakes were threatened. Fisheries reported dead and dying stock in affected zones. Salvage crews, when they could approach, prioritized containment booms and isolation of intact fuel stores. But the scale of pollution and the ongoing thermal hazard limited early mitigation. Long-term remediation, naval authorities realized, would become another theater of effort requiring specialized equipment and international coordination. Strategically, the strike recalibrated perceptions of sanctuary at sea. A harbor once considered secure for major fleet units had been exposed in a single, precisely timed action. Commanders across the theater recorded the event as evidence that fixed maritime infrastructure could not be presumed invulnerable. Doctrines of dispersal, hardened shelters, and increased ISR redundancy quickly moved from contingency plans to operational orders. For the attackers, the result provided a validated template. Legacy munitions, adapted and synchronized with multi-domain intelligence and EW, could inflict decisive damage on high-value maritime targets. The cost in human life, material, and environmental damage would be contested and revised in the weeks that followed. For the night itself, the Bay recorded a brutal accounting. 2 large hulls destroyed, port functions degraded, and a new precedent set for littoral operations. Physics had been decisive. Planning had been precise. The consequences, immediate and cascading, would shape naval conduct in the Black Sea for months to come. October 3, 2025, 05:10 a.m. Regional Command Analysis Cell. The first messages from Sevastopol arrived in fragments, broken transmissions, brief status codes, bursts of static. Then came confirmation. 2 capital ships destroyed, extensive fires across the harbor, port operations suspended. The tone of every subsequent report was the same: controlled, clipped, and disbelieving. The immediate loss was measured not just in steel, but in capability. The Minsk and Novocherkassk had been the Black Sea Fleet's amphibious core, built for rapid coastal deployments and reinforcement missions along Ukraine's southern front. Their destruction cut deep into Russia's ability to project ground power from sea to shore. Planners now faced a sudden vacuum in sea lift capacity. Repairs and salvage would take months, replacements years. Naval Command reacted with emergency redistribution. Surviving vessels were ordered to disperse to secondary ports, Feodosia, Novorossiysk, and Kerch. Fragmenting a once centralized fleet, air defense units were redeployed from inland sites to coastal perimeters. Patrol schedules doubled. The illusion of sanctuary inside Sevastopol had evaporated, replaced by a posture of permanent exposure. Logistical strain followed swiftly. Docks crippled by the blast were unusable. Cranes and fueling stations lay twisted and blackened. The loss of repair space slowed operations throughout the theater. Supply convoys were rerouted by land, increasing fuel demands and lengthening delivery times. Every adjustment compounded the fatigue already embedded in a force stretched thin by months of attrition. Strategically, the strike achieved more than destruction. It imposed paralysis. Commanders paused ongoing operations across the southern coast, unsure which of their remaining assets could be targeted next. The psychological ripple was profound. Ships that once stood as symbols of dominance now rested beneath layers of smoke and salt water. Inside command rooms, officers avoided discussing how such a strike had bypassed layered defenses. Instead, they drafted memoranda urging rapid modernization of radar networks and hardened docks. In Moscow, the Kremlin faced the delicate balance of denial and response. Official broadcasts labeled the event an act of terrorism, alleging Western coordination. Footage of burning docks looped across state television, accompanied by calls for vengeance. But internal memos painted a different picture. Panic within the Navy, pressure from political overseers, and an urgent search for scapegoats. Senior officers proposed relocating parts of the fleet eastward and accelerating shipyard construction away from the front. Internationally, the impact was immediate. Western capitals described the strike as a legitimate act of self-defense. Neutral states called for restraint, warning that the Black Sea's militarization risked spiraling beyond control. Maritime insurers raised risk premiums overnight. Shipping firms diverted commercial routes away from Crimea. The economic ripple, higher transport costs, rerouted cargo, new war risk assessments, expanded the battlefield into global markets. For Ukraine, the effect was dual-edged. The success showcased technological ingenuity and strategic patience, reinforcing confidence at home and among allies. Yet it also invited the certainty of retaliation. Intelligence services warned of probable missile barrages targeting energy infrastructure and command centers. Diplomatic channels began preparing statements to absorb whatever escalation came next. Victory, they knew, would be followed by consequence. As dawn settled over the peninsula, the bay's smoke drifted eastward across calm water. Beneath it, cranes lay collapsed. Oil slicks shimmered under early light, and the remains of two ships groaned as they sank into the shallows. Fireboats circled, spraying plumes of white mist that hissed and vanished against molten metal. Above them, reconnaissance satellites recorded the same image from orbit. A wounded harbor, half the fleet in ruins, and the unmistakable proof that no fortress at sea is beyond reach. October 3, 2025, 07:42 a.m. Kyiv. In the capital, the first briefings arrived before sunrise. There were no speeches, no celebration, just confirmation. Targets neutralized. Mission accomplished. The words were sparse, but their meaning radiated through every screen in the Ministry of Defense. Hours later, the footage began to spread worldwide, and what had been a secret operation turned into a moment that redefined the naval balance of the war. For Ukraine, Operation Tidefall was more than a military success. It was a signal, to allies, to enemies, and to itself, that ingenuity could compensate for scale. The country had proven that legacy weapons, when reshaped with data and precision, could penetrate the strongest defenses. Across Ukrainian cities still scarred by missile strikes, people watched the explosions replayed on their phones. For a few moments there was silence, then applause. Hope had returned in the form of two burning silhouettes. In Moscow, the Kremlin called the attack a provocation, promising swift retribution. Official statements framed it as terrorism. Television anchors spoke of revenge, but among naval officers morale faltered. Messages intercepted by Western intelligence captured a new tone, fear mixed with disbelief. Some called it Sevastopol's Night of Fire. Others, more cautious, called it the end of certainty. International reaction unfolded along familiar lines. NATO officials cited the strike as a legitimate act of defense under international law. European diplomats urged restraint, but privately admitted admiration for its precision. In Beijing and Ankara, quiet observers studied the operation as a case study in modern asymmetry, a smaller power leveraging innovation to unbalance a larger adversary. At the United Nations, arguments flared and predictably stalled. Accusations met vetoes, resolutions failed, and speeches filled the void left by action. But inside military institutions around the world, officers studied the data, not the debate. They saw a shift. The proof that wars could now be decided by intelligence, timing, and adaptation, rather than volume of fire. By evening, Sevastopol lay silent again. The fires had subsided, but the smoke lingered over the water. Beneath the surface, the wrecks of the Minsk and Novocherkassk rested side by side. A dark monument to the night innovation overcame armor. The Russian flag still flew above the harbor office, but its reflection trembled across an oil-slicked bay. For Ukraine, the mission had achieved more than destruction. It had rewritten the psychology of the Black Sea. And for every navy watching, a new truth had taken hold. No fortress, no fleet, and no doctrine remains invulnerable forever. Wars, from this night forward, would not be decided by numbers or tonnage, but by the will to innovate faster than fear. If you found this reconstruction insightful, remember to like the video. It helps us bring you more on-the-ground military analysis. If you want to watch more videos from the channel, watch this video here on the screen. See you there.